Well, hello, everyone, and thanks for joining today, wherever you're joining from. It's really been a great summit so far. I have loved the community and just learning from all of you. Today, I want to talk about designing AI for accessibility. My name is Heather Dowdy. I'm the Senior Program Manager of the AI for Accessibility program at Microsoft. And I'll be covering a few things today in regards to my personal journey as well as the journey of accessibility innovation. I'll talk about how it started and how it's going. And then I want to chat about inclusive AI design principles, things for us to consider, as well as examples. But first, yesterday was a special day. Yesterday, December 3rd, was the International Day of People with Disabilities or Persons with Disabilities. And it was a celebration because there are over 1 billion people living with disabilities in this world. And the theme of the International Day of People with Disabilities or Persons with Disabilities was building back better toward a disability inclusive, accessible, and sustainable post COVID-19 world. A billion people, that's a lot of people. And I can't think of a better theme considering the global pandemic that we're in, where it's been said that this billion people, this number of people living with disabilities today could grow as a result of the long-term effects of COVID. And so it's important to think about how this pandemic has exposed so many inequalities and inequities, some of which we've talked about in regards to race and gender. But today, it's important that we remember that it's impacted the disability community as well. I know that here in the United States, as well as in the UK, there were people that had to advocate for including sign language interpreters during the COVID briefings to the public. This was something that you would think that governments would just know automatically that we're issuing out and sharing very pertinent information, but yet there were people, mainly people in the deaf community, that use sign language that wasn't able to receive this information or access this information along with some of the rest of us at the beginning. And then there was just access to healthcare services for people who were directly impacted with COVID and hospitalized. There were stories about physicians, in one case, making a decision on the value of a person's life who had been impacted with COVID and whether or not to provide continual assistance. So I say all this to say that as a Black woman in tech, I know what it's like to sit in tension, and particularly because I advocate for people with disabilities. And you sit in the tension with celebrating this really great day, but you also sit in the tension of just how many things are yet to be resolved on this journey. And so I like to just kind of set some basic understanding here with the definition of disability, which really doesn't have anything to do with a person's abilities, but rather it's defined and seen as a mismatch in human interactions and in the environment. And so what I'm showing here is a chart that has the categories of touch, see, hear, and speak, as well as different scenarios in which a person might find themselves. And these scenarios range from temporary loss to situational disability to permanent. So, in the touch category, for instance, perhaps you're a new parent and you've got one arm all the time holding that baby. And so you need to do things with one hand. Or perhaps for hearing, you're in a very loud place and you're a bartender and you really can't hear what the person in front of you is saying. There are so many different ways that disability can affect us personally. And it's certainly a spectrum. We like to say that it's the one segment of the population that you can join at any time. And so, whether or not it's impacted us directly or people that we care about, it's really important to understand how our world is being developed in order to support everyone. So, when we talk about accessibility, what that is really just empowering people to have the best experience possible, and particularly empowering people with disabilities, whether at work, school, or in daily life. I will also personally add that there are other contexts in which we should think about empowering people with disabilities, whether it's in places of faith or in the courtroom, for instance. And so at Microsoft, here are 6 categories at which we focus on when we're talking about the disability community. The first being vision, people who are blind, colorblind, low vision. There can be a spectrum of vision disabilities. Hearing, very much the same way. There are some people that rely on captioning and others that rely on sign language interpreting. Neurodiversity. This is one that certainly some people might be familiar with in terms of dyslexia, autism, or other cognitive disabilities. And then learning encapsulates all of the different ways in which we can support diverse learners. There's mobility, whether that's hand dexterity or using a wheelchair, and then mental health is the last category here. So you might be wondering, why is she talking about disability and accessibility? And that's why I like to share a little bit about my journey and how it started. How many of you can perhaps remember how old you were when your typewriter was replaced with a computer, or how old you were when the internet boomed? There have been technological advances along the way in which we can remember there being a shift in our daily life. And for me, I can't remember a time where technology hasn't made an impact on me. And what I'm showing on this slide, the top is actually a signal fire alarm flasher, and the bottom picture is that of a TTY, a teletypewriter. And that's because I was pretty much born to be an ally. Both of my parents are deaf and hard of hearing. They lost their hearing as toddlers and in childbirth. And I began learning sign language at 6 months old. So, sign language and being around the deaf community is pretty much what I grew up in. It's what I'm familiar with today. But there was always some gadget in our house that pretty much allowed us to live our everyday lives. The TTY at the bottom, this teletypewriter looking device, was what my parents used to communicate with other people. But the caveat was that they had to have this bulky teletypewriter as well. And it was pretty stationary. It stayed in the house, and you could only have one line of conversation at a time. So you definitely couldn't interrupt each other. And so for me, growing up in a household with all of this different technology, I decided I wanted to be an inventor. And I soon found out that that was called an engineer. And so on this slide, in my top right quadrant, I have a picture of me and my dad walking down the streets uh, in our neighborhood in Chicago. I'm from the south side of Chicago in the United States, which is a great place to be from, but also has its challenges, particularly for people that look like my parents, people who are African American, as well as deaf. And so, what's interesting is that I went to school wanting to help people that looked like my parents, people that sat at this intersection. And I just knew from my upbringing that technology was the way to do it. And so in the upper left quadrant, I have a picture of a mobile phone with an arrow pointing to a hearing aid with an arrow pointing back to the mobile phone. And so after getting my engineering degree at college, I began working at Motorola and I focused on hearing aid compatibility initially, and then really got into the accessibility of mobile devices. It was an exciting time to be there as the phone became a touchscreen device and a smartphone. And I know for my family, it really revolutionized the way that we communicated with each other. I mean, technology is and still is a game changer for many people with disabilities. It provides access, particularly when it works well. And so, as part of being at Motorola for that time, I also got to work really closely with Google and I got to work with other handset manufacturers and really improving the Android operating system with accessibility features for people with disabilities. So, fun times. In the bottom left quadrant, I have a small screenshot of my time when I transitioned from Motorola to Microsoft. And in coming to Microsoft, I focused on web accessibility, which is also very important. And so the snippet is a screenshot of the Microsoft Careers website. And so it was one of the memorable projects I had where I was part of a larger team with different stakeholders. And my job was to make sure that this website was truly accessible so that anybody that wanted to work at Microsoft or apply for a job at Microsoft could. And so that included a lot of screen reader testing and other features for people with disabilities. What was interesting about that time is just the different partners and large companies that I got to work with and sort of influence them on the accessibility journey that Microsoft was on. And I thought it was pretty interesting that in focusing on the career site in this instance, or another project focused on making sure that my colleagues at Microsoft and at other companies were able to access their paycheck stub. That's something that you and I might take for granted that we can pull that down from a website. But when when technology isn't designed at the beginning with people with disabilities in mind, it can be really hard to retrofit it. And so these are very important parts of Microsoft's mission to really empower every organization on the planet to achieve more, but also as part of Microsoft walking the talk to actually empower the employees with disabilities that they were bringing in. So, and I think it's already been said, but there's one thing to kind of hire for diversity, and then there's another thing to really make sure that your culture is inclusive to support the people that you hire. And so the last part is that of my journey so far is that I transitioned from mobile web and now I'm in AI accessibility, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But what fits me with all of these different areas is that it allows me to really think and kind of ponder and reflect on some big questions. And one of the questions that we asked ourselves as a team is, what do we want the world to look like in 5 years? And so that sort of spawned the Microsoft AI for Good program, where we're really looking at how to leverage AI technology to truly make an impact on societal issues. And so there are currently 5 programs under the AI for Good umbrella, and there are several other initiatives, but these include AI for Earth, AI for Humanitarian Action, AI for Cultural Heritage, and AI for Health. Which brings me to our program, which is AI for Accessibility. And what I love about our program is that we're really seeking to empower those 1 billion people on the planet living with a disability. And we are looking to just help support folks that are researchers, um, that are in the nonprofit organizations, as well as startups. And I get to partner with these folks every day, and we make sure that we are looking to fund projects in teams that are really rooted in the communities that they want to serve. And so our four focus areas include the first, education. And this is really about increasing access and providing accommodations in the diverse ways that students learn. COVID and the global pandemic have really highlighted this need with the onset and transition to remote learning. But quite honestly, there's a lot of work to be done. Perhaps you've seen in the news, there have been legal action taken against academic institutions for not being able to provide an accessible experience for students with disabilities. And so that's definitely one of our focus areas and one that I'm truly passionate about and we'll talk more about. The second area is employment. The unemployment rate for people with disabilities has pretty much been stagnant for the last 30 years. And so I'm excited to disrupt what has been really and kind of reimagine the future of work through employment solutions that really not only equip people, but provide tools in the workplace and push the inclusive culture that again is needed in order to be able to support the advancement and hiring of people with disabilities. The third area is community. And with community, we talk a lot about solutions in terms of connecting people with disabilities, but we also talk a lot about mental health, which is a growing disability all around the world. And then lastly, our focus area of home really gets at a lot of the devices that we find in our homes and how we can make them smarter and more contextually relevant using AI. So the AI for Accessibility is a grant program and it's a $25 million investment over 5 years that really wants to accelerate um, and empower people with disabilities in each of these focus areas. So that's a lot about my journey, but now let's talk about the journey of accessibility innovation. And I have to start with these gloves. My goodness, when people hear about my story and me being a native sign language user and my family, I get articles about this hackathon project every couple months. And this is a picture of sign language gloves. And what you're seeing is just pieces of fabric with some wires and mini circuit boards on the gloves. And so, people will send articles like, isn't this great? You're going to be able to use this and your family can use this and it'll be able to translate sign language. Well, I have this picture up and I also have what innovation is not. It is not sign language gloves. I've even seen like sparkly ones where I want to say, you get a glove, you get a glove, you get a glove. But no, this is not how me, myself, or my community want to interact with each other, want to stand out. This is not how we interact with each other today using these bulky gloves. And so that's why I use it here as a reminder that innovation is really rooted in solving a human need. And trust me, if you look around, if you observe people, there's enough of a human need to solve. And so being rooted in actually how people are already existing today and living today and what the needs are that arise from that sort of then can lead to some of the technology innovation that we've seen. And that's how you kind of get this process or progress. And this whole process of innovation is iterative. Again, focusing on human centric design. So accessibility innovation, how it started. I like to say the disability community is no stranger to hacking solutions. That's what happens when you have systems that aren't built for you. You have to figure out a way. And so these are examples of innovations that have come from the disability community. And quite honestly, they benefit all of us today. So the left one is an on-screen keyboard very useful for people with limited mobility, but also something that we take for granted now in our smartphones. But where it started was filling a need. Then there's word prediction and magnification. So that's sort of how it started in terms of having to hack solutions. And now I want to talk a little bit about how it's going.
Seeing AI is a Microsoft research project for people with visual impairments. The app narrates the world around you by turning the visual world into an audible experience. Point your phone's camera, select a channel, and hear a description. The app recognizes saved friends.
Jenny near top right, 3 feet away.
Describes the people around you, including their emotions.
28-year-old female wearing glasses looking happy.
It reads text out loud as it comes into view, like on an envelope.
Ken Lawrence, P.O. Box.
Or a room entrance.
Conference 2005.
Or scan and read documents like books and letters. The app will guide you and recognize the text with its formatting.
Top and left edge is not visible. Hold steady. Lease agreement. This agreement
When paying with cash, the app identifies currency bills.
$20 US.
When looking for something in your pantry or at the store, use the barcode scanner with audio cues to help you find what you want.
Campbell's tomato soup.
When available, hear additional product details.
Heated microwave bowl on height.
And even hear descriptions of images in other apps like Twitter by importing them into Seeing AI.
A close-up of Bill Gates.
Finally, explore our experimental features like scene descriptions to get a glimpse of the future.
I think it's a young girl throwing a frisbee in the park.
Experience the world around you with the Seeing AI app from Microsoft.
So, Seeing AI is a free mobile app that pretty much turns the visual world into an audible experience for people that are blind or have low vision. And it does so by harnessing the power of AI, whether that's identifying currency or providing a description of a person. It focuses on people, text, and objects. And this particular app came out of a hackathon. Um, at our company, but to have it out on the market is one of the things that I get approached about a lot because it really has, again, been a game changer for people who are blind and have low vision. How's it going? Live captions and subtitles. You are seeing AI generated captions on the bottom of my screen now, and it's something that all of us can easily use within our slide sharing software. And so, what's interesting about this is that it not only helps people who are deaf or hard of hearing in a meeting participate, and it's inclusive and accessible in that regards, but again, uh, this idea of designing for one and extending to many, the benefits are also reaped by um, non-native speakers that can also leverage subtitles by translating the captions. So an important thing to remember is that inclusion really does drive innovation for everyone. And so especially that might be like preaching to the choir to this group, but there are still attitudes towards accessibility that it is difficult or that it requires too much time or too much money, but there are ways to do it. And of course, the way to do it is upfront when you can, and including people with disabilities in the process not only benefits and solves a real need, but it really extends the benefit to all of us. And so on this slide, in the top left quadrant, there are bendy straws that are really great for people with limited mobility, perhaps in a hospital bed. Then in the top right, there's an OXO kitchen tool. This one is of a can opener and this kind of user-friendly grip and handle. And then there's speech recognition on the bottom and as well as television captioning. Again, the main thing to remember is that this is sort of like a pot of gold in terms of thinking about what really could be and when we include everyone. So let's talk specifically about inclusive AI design. And in doing so, as we've already talked about in this conference, which I'm really loving, is that there are lots of ethical considerations around AI. And in this example, I bring up HireVue, which is a video interviewing platform, and it is able to kind of read expressions and make judgments of a job candidate's performance based on their facial expressions or their tone of voice. But what's interesting is if you take a step back and think like, okay, well, that's really exciting, and perhaps it reduces bias in one area. What if the job candidate has is living with Down syndrome, and so perhaps their face is not symmetrical? What happens to the algorithm then? Or what if there's a delay in response because the job candidate is speaking with a sign language interpreter for the interview? And so all of these things are important to think about when we think about implementing the latest and greatest AI solution. But it's important to think about, was it tested with a diverse population, to really think through the ways that we can mitigate bias. So in talking about bias, it's important to recognize it. I know that outside of this group, lots of people just think, well, is AI a good thing or is it a bad thing? I mean, and I like to say AI or is just as biased as the people making it. However, it's important that we just recognize what bias is there and use tools and people to mitigate it. And so in terms of recognizing bias in AI, there are 5 ways in which we could talk about that. One is being in the definition of AI itself. So AI, artificial intelligence, technology that is meant to complement human decision making. But even in using the word intelligence, what exactly is intelligence, and is that term ableist, considering that there are many different ways that people perceive, many different ways that people learn and reason? Then it's also important to realize with data sets that sometimes or many times disability can be seen as falling outside of the norm of what we're modeling. And so even that type of bias towards to collecting data and using that data is something that needs to be captured and dealt with. There's a lot of examples of bias in data sets. When I think about just voice assistants and the research that has been published around uh, the accuracy being low in voice assistants and speech recognition because the user might have a feminine high pitched voice. There's also research around the inaccuracies with speech recognition for Black voices. And so, what's interesting about this is that it pretty much then, when you have a system that doesn't work for you, you don't use it as much. And so, the data that is then collected is around a set of users that are probably not diverse, and it continues to be a homogeneous data set in that sense that you're using the data from your user group to reinforce the machine learning algorithm. And so again, it's important to diversify data that's being collected. What we say in the disability community and AI is that there's sort of this data desert. Uh, Machine learning requires lots and lots of data, but what we have found is that it's pretty easy for anyone to take a picture of a plant, for instance, in order to categorize or recognize plants in a model. but to sit down and collect hours and hours of quality data for a speech recognition model with people that have impacted speech, people with cerebral palsy, it's going to be a quality over quantity issue. And so, how do we then continue to be able to make sure that we collect data, even though it can take more time, and also focus on making sure that we recognize and are clear about what limitations are in our data sets when we have excluded marginalized communities. So with associations, we've seen this in terms of facial recognition for Black women who have their hair pulled back and aren't smiling. There are lots of ways in which association bias shows up. Automated decisions, the one example that I will talk about there is with some of the autonomous driving systems, where they have difficulty detecting pedestrians in the crosswalk. But what happens when the pedestrian is moving using a wheelchair? If you don't understand human behavior, particularly when using a wheelchair, that machine or an algorithm wouldn't be able to make the right automated decision when that person in a wheelchair actually backs up a little bit in the crosswalk in order to get over the curb. And so there has been research with that um, issue within some of the algorithms as well. And then interaction bias. Uh, we deal with a lot of chatbots in terms of just as a simple implementation of AI. And an example with a chatbot for interaction bias is where you're trying to design the system to kind of clamp down on toxic language. But there was one instance where the chatbot was actually labeling anything related to disability as toxic language. And so how does that impact people where disability is very much a part of their identity, and have these machines been trained in how people with disabilities talk about themselves and their lived experience? And then lastly, confirmation bias. What I really like about thinking about this one a lot, and I was actually just talking with my teammate about it last week, is that so much of AI is about using the past to predict the future. But what happens when the past wasn't really set up for you? For you living at an intersection, for you living at the intersection of gender, race, and disability, for instance. And so we have found this in terms of thinking about and trying to uh, document just employment journeys for people with disabilities, that there's some bias inherent in the way that employment pathways have been handled for people with disabilities in the past that we don't want to repeat in the future. But yet, again, there's data that's needed in order to make a machine learning model. And so I like to think about this one a lot. And if folks have any ideas around this or want to talk further, please let me know. But again, it's kind of this tension of what has been and where you're trying to go. So these pillars here talk about Microsoft's responsible AI in terms of fairness, reliability, and safety. Privacy and security is one that I'm going to touch on in a minute. Inclusiveness, of course, transparency, and accountability. What I do want to call out here is there's a link that I've provided just to talk a lot more about these ethical considerations within the disability lens, and that's at aka.ms/disability AI ethics, all one word. Definitely check out the research that's been done there. So talking about summarizing this portion in terms of 5 principles of inclusive AI design is one, just redefine bias as a spectrum. again, might be preaching to the choir here, but it's sort of a parallel to um, the anti-racism journey that many people that are not of color started this weekend, where it's really kind of hard to check your own privilege and your own bias. But the sooner that we can do that, the more that we can unlearn some things in order to learn new things. And so just simply redefine bias as a spectrum and figure out how to mitigate it. And in doing so, it's important to enlist the users that will be using the system to correct that bias. And there's a saying in the disability community, nothing about us without us. We don't want solutions that are designed for people with disabilities. We want solutions that are designed with and by people with disabilities because they're the experts on their lived experience. And then cultivate diversity with privacy and consent. Representation matters. And so the part that I wanted to say here is just as with race, you know, people with disabilities, living with disabilities, um, have had some burns, I will say, have cultivated some mistrust in terms of technology and using data against them. But we know that we need diversity in our data sets. We know that we need diversity all the way around. And so there are ways to thoughtfully include people with disabilities. And in order to do that, there's going to have to be clear privacy and consent measures in order to be transparent and accountable, as we talked about in the previous slide with those responsible AI pillars. But really, because we're going to need to incentivize people to trust what we do with the data. And then balancing intelligence with discovery. Oh, yeah, like there there is so much that can be reinforced by how our users are using our AI solution, but there needs to be flexibility and choice. Oh my goodness, I'm just a big advocate for choice. Um, and that's just because no two people with a disability have the same disability. And so, for instance, if you have two people with a hearing disability, their hearing loss might vary between those two people. And so, how do you then design for that? You have to kind of build in that flexibility and allow for discovering just new ways to serve diverse users. And then lastly, builds inclusive AI teams. I love talking about the future of accessibility because one, it's time to disrupt a system that hasn't worked for people with disabilities, but also because I want them at the table to build the future, the inclusive future that we all need. So want to go over some inclusive AI design examples using our four focus areas. The first one is home. The challenge is that 1 in 10 people living with disabilities have access to the assistive technology that they need. And this could be that people are with disabilities are left out of voice assistance and voice powered experiences, which might be just like a nice to have leisure type of technology for some of us, but could be really crucial in how that person does their job. Um, and then there's also a lack of accessible transportation and software tools. And so, really, at the root of this is a lack of inclusive data sets that include people with disabilities, but also just ableist biases and models. And so one feature project in our home category is the University of Texas, where researchers are really focusing on how to improve automatic image descriptions of photos. And these photos are actually taken by people who are blind and have low vision. Why that's important is that there are lots of pictures on the internet and within visual recognition data sets, but those pictures are not taken by people who are blind or low vision. And so they tend to be these nice cropped pictures where the object is in view. But as I showed earlier with the Seeing AI app, when the device is in the hand of a person who is blind or low vision, you might be getting a different view. And so, are you still able to give the information that they need with the view that they're seeing and the pictures that they're taking? Another challenge in mental health is that in some countries, like in India, and we have a project around that, there is only one mental health professional for every 100,000 people. And when you compare that with the fact that there has been estimated to be 1 in 5 people living with a mental health condition, it's really time to take all disabilities seriously. Over 70% of disabilities aren't visible. So it's not always that we can tell exactly um, what disability a person is living with. And so in our future project here, we have Mental Health America, Northwestern University, and University of Toronto that are looking at collecting data. They're kind of mirroring some low um, tech messaging with AI, an AI model to figure out the best times to present mental health and behavioral interventions for people with mental health conditions. And this is um, such an important project, I believe, just because alone in the pandemic, the number of people who have been doing depression screenings has really jumped. Mental Health America says, I believe there's about like 800,000 screens since the start of the pandemic. And then we also know that this is disproportionately affecting communities of color, particularly the Black community. And so, wanting to kind of figure out exactly how we democratize mental health solutions for everyone is really what the concern here. And mental health is the largest disability segment in the world, and it is growing. The other thing I'll say too, um, I have a unique view of being at the intersection of so many identities, but I can't stress enough how there needs to be more conversations on mental health. Um, this summer, in addition to the pandemic, we saw the largest global civil rights movement in history with the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Arbery. And what a lot of people weren't talking about is that it's been estimated that about 50% of the Black people that die in police interaction have a mental health disability. And so that intersection is not really talked about because when I think about my parents and my family and my friends, who are African American and deaf, for instance, when you're interacting with an officer or someone else, they don't see your disability yet. Oh, they see that you're Black first, because that's what they see first. And then if you are able to, you could disclose your disability if you wanted to. So just a lot to unpack there with how intersectionality um, affects the disability community as well, where, being Black and deaf, for instance, or just Black with a disability, period, you go to the Black community and you have one experience, and you go to the disability community and you have another experience being at that intersection. But moving on, in employment, I talked a little bit about just the unemployment rate being pretty stagnant. Um, and it's high for some disability segments than others, but overall, it's about twice that. The unemployment rate is twice that for a person living with a disability compared to without. And so the future project here is Vanderbilt University that is actually creating a virtual job coach for people living with autism. And so they're actually taking stress levels and using eye gaze signals in order to have the virtual coach adjust perhaps the tone or perhaps the questions in the interview. And so why this is so important is because a lot of times we build solutions or we have this mindset that, hey, the person with a disability needs to shift. But again, if it's nothing to do with their ability and it's more of a mismatch in the environment or interaction, how can we shift? And this virtual job coach is an example of that. So, coming to education, one of the topics I'm truly passionate about, and that's because when you think about this journey in the life of a student with a disability, there tends to be so many challenges and barriers along the way, which I totally identify with as a Black woman in tech. But adding on disability and on top of that. Just kind of exacerbates the entire thing. But there's this drop off between, high school graduation rates, entering into college, and even getting to employment. And so we definitely want to support more solutions there. And the feature project here is Enable and iSTEM that they've created this eye assistant to empower blind and low vision test takers. They're using like OCR, optical character recognition in terms of math problems. There's also some custom speech and some Lewis language understanding modeling and services used there to really provide this conversational experience where before students in places like Kenya and India would rely on getting a test taker a couple minutes before they had to take their test. And this test taker might not know anything about STEM, and their experience could be really disheartening to be able to take a test and rely on this other person. And so fostering more independence here is the goal. So I am going to just skip over this quickly because I know that we're running out of time. But that was a project focused on students with multiple disabilities in lower socioeconomic regions and how to use speech recognition in order to improve reading fluency. And that's the Zyrobotics project. You can find out more about all of these projects on our website for our program, which I will provide in just a minute. But the last thing that I want us to think about in terms of education, and I'm sure that many of you all kind of share my passion in just skilling folks in order to increase the diversity in STEM as well as in AI. And so one of my passion projects has been the Microsoft Ninja Camp, which I founded, which is a 1 week STEM training camp for high school students with disabilities. And it's really just to expose them to the diversity of careers that are available in STEM, and also to kind of get them starting to think about their strengths and advocating for themselves as future disability leaders. And so what I like about this program and also what I've seen with this 100 Brilliant Women in AI Ethics event is just the intentionality in making sure that you are passing along learnings and also being diverse in who you're bringing to the table. And so that takes really kind of sitting through and scouring and kind of going past your Rolodex in order to make sure that more and more people are at the table, which I love to do. And I do hold space for people who aren't at the table today in this conversation. But I know that through efforts like this, more people are coming. And I know through this summit as well, that we can really come together as a community to sort of pass along what we've learned in order to really reimagine what the future of AI and the future of our society could be to make sure that it's more inclusive. And so I want to, in doing that, I wanted to share this opportunity through the AI for Accessibility grant program, where we are looking for proposals on education that really leverage AI within education to empower students with disabilities and to increase representation of people with disabilities in STEM careers. And so there's an opportunity for funding as well as technology support and credits. And the website that I was talking about, where you can find out about our funding opportunities, as well as the projects I mentioned and a lot of other projects I didn't mention, is at aka.ms/AI for the number 4A. So with that, I just wanted to leave you all with a question of just how will you build a more accessible and disability inclusive world? It it goes beyond just being inspired. And what I love about what I've seen with this community so far is that many people are already doing the work, willing to champion others, and willing to teach others. And for me, I definitely think that that is the way forward. Again, I want to see more and more people with lived experiences, lived disability experiences included in our networks, included at the table. And so not only am I holding space for them, but I am totally all about empowering the next generation of inclusive leaders. And that's because there's a lot at stake. There's a lot at stake here in order to really make sure that our future and our society is as accessible and inclusive as it can be for everyone. And so whether that shift has happened as a result of COVID or something else, in terms of people that you come in contact with, it really is no better time than now to reimagine things. People with disabilities have been screaming for flexible work for quite some time. And then with the pandemic, it was able to happen for many of us. And so for the future, perhaps there's more that we can learn from the lived disability experience that will truly lead to the next innovation in AI and for our society. And so I will be available afterwards on Twitter. You can find me at Heather D, as in David, Builds, Builds, because I'm all about building something, or online at LinkedIn. Thank you all for having me today.
Well, thank you so much for being here today, Heather, and for such an eye-opening session and for sharing your incredible journey with us all. And we really appreciate you highlighting the importance to the tech world to focus on disability and accessibility. I invite you all to join Heather on Twitter. She'll be available for the next 15 minutes or so. And we're going to take a quick break and we will be back within 5 minutes. See you all soon.